Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. We are going to get into part 2 and probably part 3 of the Deluge series today. I'm not entirely sure I'm going to do both. It'll depend kind of on how quickly I get through the first one. Also, I think I'm going to do the Sabaton history for Night Witches later on this afternoon. I know a couple people had said there was a different animated video, but I'm hoping that I can get the information out of just the Sabaton history one so that I don't have to redo the song and all of that. But that's the plan. I'm hoping to get through the rest of the Deluge series and hopefully a Sabaton history today. So also, before we get started, I have the Discord open and everything's been up and running with that. So if you want to join the Discord, I will put it in the comments below. But with all that being said, let's get into it. The Deluge Part 2, History of Poland.
2 men, 1 goal. Only one will emerge victorious. In the red corner we have John Casimir, the legitimate king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So far, his reign has been disastrous. Due to internal revolts and foreign invasions, the Commonwealth has lost most of its territory and John Casimir himself was exiled.
Lost Ukraine, lost Lithuania, lost Poland. What's left? I'm trying to picture a map in my head. I can't what is left after that? I don't know. Let me see if they show a map.
In the blue corner is one of the invaders, Charles Gustav, the King of Sweden, with one of the most modern armies in Europe. The dissenting nobles offered Charles Gustav to become the king of the Commonwealth, and as a result what was left of the country acknowledged his authority. In this episode, John Casimir and Charles Gustav will clash over the kingdom of Poland. But how did it come to be that Charles Gustav, the King of Sweden, also became the king of the Commonwealth? In 1655, the Commonwealth was unable to stop the Cossack revolt and the Russian invasion. At that time, Sweden invaded the country from the west. The Swedish army was one of the best in Europe. The situation was desperate. However, the nobles had an idea. If they acknowledged the Swedish king as their overlord, not only would they not have to fight the Swedish army, but they could use the Swedish army's help to recover the lands lost to Russia and the Cossacks.
Yeah, and so you can see the viewpoint from the people there, from the nobles. Not only are we getting, out of having to fight Sweden, which we absolutely do not want to fight, but then if we give the crown to Sweden, then they can go fight the Cossacks in Russia, and then we don't really have to fight anybody. We can play this right and just keep the same territory, have a different different head of state, and everything will be good, right? Of course, what's the issue with that? The person you're giving the crown to has to be interested in taking out Russia and the Cossacks and maintaining the territory and everything like that. If they're not, then you're taking a massive gamble that any of this is going to work out, right? Like if exactly the right thing does not happen here, then it's going to be a miss by the nobles who gave the crown up.
So Charles Gustav was acknowledged as the Commonwealth's king by the nobles, and his forces occupied the remaining parts of the kingdom of Poland. But there was a flaw in this plan. Charles Gustav was not interested in ruling the Commonwealth as its monarch and helping to restore its lands. His real goals were to annex the lands near the Baltic Sea into Sweden and also plunder the Commonwealth's territory. Instead of helping the Commonwealth in the war, the Swedish army started looting the country clean of valuables.
Yikes.
The Commonwealth's people became disappointed in the Swedish rule, and the tensions between the Protestant Swedish army and mostly Catholic Poles began to flare up. An anti-Swedish guerrilla campaign spread in the...
That's hilarious. Look, he's got like an AK in the background there.
countryside, and many of the nobles considered defecting back to John Casimir. The Swedes' control over the country was weakened. John Casimir saw this as an opportunity and returned to the Commonwealth to lead the revolt against the Swedes. On paper, the Swedish forces were large, but the Commonwealth's nobles were disgruntled by the Swedish rule and refused to fight. Most of the Swedish army had to be dispersed in many garrisons to fight off guerrillas, and Charles Gustav was only able to field a small mobile force. He relied on speed and aggression to crush the revolt. He quickly marched out to quell the rebellion before it could grow large and pushed into the territory controlled by John Casimir. However, by that time, John Casimir's army was far larger than the Swedish force. They chased the Swedes back and at one point managed to encircle Charles Gustav's army. Eventually, the Swedes managed to break free and regroup in Warsaw. It was clear to Charles Gustav that he needed a much larger army to defeat John Casimir.
What is the overall strategic goal, though, for Gustav? If he doesn't want the territory, like maybe he wants it, but if that's not part of his strategic goal, if the goal is just the small amount of territory up by the sea, then what is his issue with the revolts or anything else? I guess what I'm wondering is, if he doesn't care about the land itself, then the attitude of like whatever happens and plunder all of it and, you know, basically just use the land makes sense. But then if that's the case, then why does he care what else happens to it? Like, why does he care if there's a revolt or whatever? Like, whatever, just pull back to the territory by the coast and call it a day. If that's not the case and he does care about it, then I don't understand why he's going about it or the way he went about it in the way that he did, by plundering it, by, you know, making all the nobles become disillusioned with him. I don't know. Like, I'm wondering exactly what his goal is here, because I feel like his actions are kind of like on both sides of the line.
And he went abroad to raise one. Witnessing the success of the revolt, most of the Commonwealth nobles defected to John Casimir, and from now on, the Swedish control over Poland relied only on their garrisons. John Casimir's forces took Warsaw. By that time, Charles Gustav was back with a decent-sized force. His plan was to use the quality of his troops to destroy John Casimir's army in battle. John Casimir was aware of the quality of the Swedish army, but he had gained several advantages. He had united the Commonwealth nobles behind him, and his forces had a considerable numerical advantage over the Swedes. Also, having Warsaw behind them benefited the morale of his army. He hoped that with the help of these advantages, he would best the Swedes on the battlefield. The battle ended in a Swedish victory, and they entered Warsaw, but they weren't able to inflict heavy casualties on John Casimir's army. In this situation, neither side could achieve full victory. Both sides changed strategies. John Casimir still had many more men than Charles Gustav. He planned to use it to engage the Swedes in a large number of smaller engagements, where the Swedish advantages in tactics and firepower were smaller, and ultimately defeat the Swedish army in a war of attrition. Charles Gustav's main problem was the lack of manpower. Bringing a massive army of mercenaries to the region was too expensive and would take too much time. The Commonwealth's neighbors had many troops nearby, but Charles Gustav still had to pay them somehow. Well, he could pay them by allocating them land in Poland that they would conquer together. So he decided to draw in the smaller nations by partitioning the Commonwealth between its smaller neighbors. Brandenburg, Transylvania, and the Cossacks answered his call. Sweden would keep the lands near the sea. The Elector of Brandenburg would get northwest, the Cossacks would get the east, and the Prince of Transylvania would get the rest. John Casimir's forces were clearly outmatched. He had only bad options. He could meet the invading armies in battle, but the odds of victory were small, and if he was defeated, he could lose most of his army. That would mean losing the war. On the other hand, he could harass the enemy forces and keep his army together as long as possible and hope for the best. But this would only postpone his ultimate defeat, as it would make his lands fully exposed to the invaders, and it would only be a question of time until the Commonwealth's population would be plundered into submission.
Yeah, so the initial idea from him was actually pretty good, right? The strategy of essentially just wearing down the Swedish army. Because if you go meet them in big, massive, set-piece battles, you could really take some damage at one time. So instead of that, you meet them in a bunch of smaller engagements where you don't have a chance of having your whole army wiped out. And even though you don't have the chance to wipe out his entire army, you can still take enough casualties that over time it will start to make a huge impact, right? So that initial strategy makes sense to me. Unfortunately, he got outmaneuvered here. The call to arms, with the enticement being Polish lands, was pretty brilliant here. But that's what I don't totally understand, is he wants the land close to the sea. Even in this deal, that will be the case. Sweden will get the land close to the sea. So what's the issue with the rest of the territory? And why was he like plundering it and kind of being an overall dick about it early on? It seems like a much easier way to accomplish this would just be to either hold all of the territory as a legitimate monarch, or allow it to separate or do whatever it wants to do, and you keep the territory. You could even, if there were even parts of it that weren't necessarily like in your territory at that point, you could even have some sort of trade there with a lot of the larger territory that's further south that you don't really care about, right? And so I just don't understand the overall thought process here from start to finish. It seems like smart decisions in individual like situations, but the overall grand strategy I don't fully understand. So somebody explain that to me.
He chose the latter option. In the next year, the Allies invaded the Commonwealth. John Casimir's forces were not able to contain their advance. The Cossacks and the Transylvanians moved in from the south and went towards Krakow. On their way, they put the Lesser Poland to fire and sword. After reinforcing the Swedish garrison in Krakow, they moved north to meet up with the Swedish army. Having joined forces with the Swedes, their combined army now marched through central Poland, burning and looting on their path. They established a garrison in the region. Finally, they turned their sights at Warsaw, which John Casimir's forces had regained in the meantime. The Allies moved in and took the town without much trouble. The campaign so far had been a success, and in time the Allies would be able to gain full control over Poland. The Swedish successes had antagonized many of the European powers, and by that time Sweden found itself in a war with Russia, Denmark, and the Holy Roman Emperor. This was more than Sweden could manage. But Charles Gustav knew the solution to this problem. He had to knock one of its enemies out of the war fast. The question was, which one? Russia and the Holy Roman Emperor were too large to defeat quickly, and he had to choose between the Commonwealth and Denmark. Sweden was winning the war against the Commonwealth, but with John Casimir not willing to make peace, it would still take some years to conquer it completely. Charles Gustav left a strong garrison in his partition of the Commonwealth and chose to attack Denmark.
Yep.
The Danes thought that Charles Gustav would bring his army back to Sweden to defend his country from the Danish invasion and position their troops accordingly.
Nope.
But Charles Gustav took another route from the south. He surprised the Danish defenders and easily took over Jutland, but was separated from the rest of Denmark by the Danish Straits. Unfortunately for the Danes, the winter that year had proved to be especially cold, and the straits froze. Swedes crossed the sea on ice, and soon the Swedish army was before Copenhagen.
Brutal. The winter got so cold that it turns to ice, and he just marches across. God, that is such bad luck. Yeah, so basically the whole idea the whole idea here is the Denmark is essentially going to go take southern Sweden and work their way up, right? So the thought process is if Sweden's going to come, if Sweden is going to bring their army back to defend it, they're going to go around up through the north towards the south, and then they're going to hold the rest of that territory, right? That's not what happened. Instead, they go take Denmark, then march across the straits, and then now they're at southern Sweden anyway. Like that's some terrible luck for Denmark.
Copenhagen, the Danish capital. Confronted with the possibility of losing his capital, the King of Denmark offered Charles Gustav many of his lands in return for peace. Just as he planned, Charles Gustav had quickly knocked Denmark out of the war. But things were going bad for Sweden in the Commonwealth. John Casimir's decision to keep his army intact had proven to be the right one. With Swedish army gone, Sweden's allies were not able to match the strength of the Commonwealth's army. Faced with unfavorable odds, the Transylvanians began their retreat from Warsaw to regroup in the south. John Casimir's forces followed and harassed them on the march, and finally the whole force was surrounded. In return for a safe passage home, the Prince of Transylvania agreed to leave the Swedish alliance and relinquish all of his conquests. Transylvania was out of the war. Now it was time to deal with Brandenburg. Brandenburg's army was similar to that of Sweden, and here John Casimir resorted to diplomacy instead of warfare. Officially, the East Prussian domains of Brandenburg were owned by the Commonwealth, and Brandenburg administered them as a vassal. John Casimir offered Brandenburg full control over East Prussia if it was to change the sides in the war. Brandenburg agreed, and pulled back its forces and declared war on Sweden. By that time, the army of the Holy Roman Emperor arrived in the region. Now Sweden's enemies on the southern coast of the Baltic Sea heavily outnumbered the Swedish army, and despite knocking Denmark out of the war, Sweden's position had not improved. It seemed that Sweden would not be able to win the war, but Charles Gustav was still optimistic and looked for the target he could strike next. A campaign in the southern Baltic did not promise easy victory, but there was a place where achieving victory was more than probable. It was Denmark. Swedish forces occupied a lot of the country since the previous war, and all the land Denmark directly controlled besides its Norwegian domains was the area around its capital. Charles Gustav decided to take Copenhagen, and this time not only knock Denmark out of the war, but also out of existence, and annex the Danish mainland into Sweden. He landed his army near Copenhagen and began the siege. But then the Dutch joined the war against Sweden and sent their fleet to help Copenhagen. With a stream of reinforcements and supplies coming to Copenhagen, Charles Gustav was not able to take the town. At the same time,
See, this, for people that saw my earlier videos about talking specifically about the perks that come if you go Navy instead of Army. Not all the way. The split isn't that you have to pick between, Sparta or Athens. You have to have this fully ingrained ground force or this awesome Navy. You don't have to do all or nothing on either of them, but building up a naval power that is at least semi-significant on the world stage enables you to do so many things because so many cities are right by the coast, right? I mean, so much of the world's population, even today, so much of the world's population is right by the coast. And so having a strong Navy just enables you to do so many different things that countries without them were not able to do, and there isn't one factor that you could point to and say, this is why these countries had good navies and this is why these countries didn't. They're kind of all over the place on the countries that had good navies. So I feel like that is something that could have been potentially beneficial for Sweden in the long run, is the building of a larger, more pronounced on the world stage fleet, right? I don't know, just my thoughts.
They were unable to leave the Danish islands due to the naval blockade. Meanwhile, the coalition's forces captured many of Sweden's fortresses on the southern Baltic. They also moved into Denmark and slowly pushed the Swedish army out of most of the country. Sweden had lost many of its conquests. Then Charles Gustav fell ill and died. The new Swedish government decided to cut their losses and make peace. By that time, Sweden had still retained some of their fortresses in their partition of the Commonwealth, but they had lost their positions in Germany. They agreed to trade their fortresses in the Commonwealth for the return of their domains in Germany, and soon the last Swedish soldiers left the Commonwealth and the Swedish invasion was over. John Casimir had won. He hadn't managed to best the Swedish army on the battlefield, but he was able to outlast the Swedish war effort and had gained full control over Poland. But his work was far from complete. Russia and the Cossacks still controlled more of the Commonwealth's territory than the Commonwealth itself, and he was determined to take it back. And when that was done, it was necessary to make it so that the Commonwealth would never again fall victim to another deluge. But that in the next episode. Thanks to...
Okay, so that was part 2 for the history of Poland, the deluge. I think what I'm going to do is split this up into 2 videos, so I'll do part 3. I think here in a little bit. I'm not entirely sure because I want to get to the Sabaton history today. So I may end up doing part 3 of the deluge tomorrow and then starting the Sabaton history right after this. But either way, there will be another video out after this one sometime later today. It'll either be part 3 to this series or it'll be the Sabaton history for Night Witches. So that'll be out soon. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here, and I will see you all next time.